The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the lone cabin as Katherine Granger clutched her infant son closer to her chest, flinching at the sound of distant hoofbeats. 3 months of hiding had taught her to fear any approach, but with winter bearing down and supplies dwindling, she wondered how much longer she could protect her child from both the elements and the town that had branded her a witch. The year was 1878, and the small settlement of Redemption Creek, Colorado, had turned against Katherine with a viciousness that still haunted her dreams. Once respected as the schoolteacher, she had fallen from grace when her husband died under mysterious circumstances, leaving her pregnant and vulnerable to the town's suspicions. Rumors spread like wildfire that she had practiced dark arts, that her herbs and remedies were the work of the devil, that she had somehow caused the death of her husband. By the time little Thomas was born, Katherine had been forced to flee in the night, taking shelter in an abandoned trapper's cabin deep in the foothills. Katherine placed Thomas in his makeshift cradle, a drawer lined with her old petticoats, and moved to the fireplace where a meager stew bubbled. The cabin was drafty, with gaps between the logs that she'd stuffed with moss and cloth, but it kept out the worst of the mountain wind. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, and Katherine's heart pounded in her chest. The rifle her husband had left behind stood in the corner, loaded but untouched. She had never fired a gun before and prayed she wouldn't have to start now. The approaching rider slowed, and Katherine heard the creak of a saddle as someone dismounted. Heavy boots crunched on the fallen leaves outside. She grabbed the rifle, holding it awkwardly as she positioned herself between the door and her sleeping child. 3 solid knocks rattled the door. "Hello, is anyone there?" The voice was deep, masculine, but not threatening. "I saw your chimney smoke, just looking for directions." Katherine remained silent, the rifle trembling in her hands. "I mean no harm," the voice continued. "I'm a stranger to these parts. My name is Clayton Galloway. I've been riding since dawn and seem to have lost my way." The name meant nothing to her, which was somewhat reassuring. If he'd been sent from town, he would have known exactly who he was looking for. "Please, madam, if you're in there, night's coming on fast and there's weather brewing. I just need to know which direction to Redemption Creek." At the mention of the town, Katherine stiffened. "Ride north for about 7 miles, she called through the door, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Follow the creek downstream, you'll see it." There was a pause. "Thank you, madam, I appreciate the help." The man didn't move away, though. After a moment, he spoke again. "Are you all right in there?" "Your voice sounds troubled." "I'm fine," Katherine replied, too quickly. "Please be on your way." A gust of wind howled through the trees, and Katherine heard the man sigh. "Storm's moving in faster than I thought. Would you mind terribly if I took shelter in your barn until it passes?" "I won't be any bother." Katherine bit her lip. There was no barn, just a lean-to where she kept the goat she had stolen when she fled. "There's no barn," she answered. "I see." Another pause. "Madam, I don't mean to intrude, but I've been tracking weather long enough to know this is going to be a bad one. I've got supplies on my horse. I'd be happy to share them in exchange for a corner to wait out the storm." As if to emphasize his point, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first few drops of rain began to patter on the roof. Thomas stirred in his makeshift cradle, making small, fussing noises that would soon turn to cries. "Madam, I hear a child in there. Please let me help." "I swear on my mother's grave I mean no harm." Katherine hesitated, looking from the door to her son and back again. The winter was coming early this year, and she was desperately low on supplies. If this storm was as bad as the man predicted, she and Thomas might not survive without help. "Stand back from the door," she commanded, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have a rifle." "Yes, madam," came the reply, and she heard boots scuffing backward. Keeping the rifle ready, Katherine unlatched the door and pushed it open a crack. Standing several paces back was a tall man with broad shoulders, dressed in practical riding clothes with a duster that had seen better days. His hat was pulled low, but she could see a strong jaw covered in a few days' growth of beard. His hands were raised to shoulder height, palms out. "Evening, madam," he said quietly. "Clayton Galloway at your service." Katherine studied him warily. His blue eyes held no malice she could detect, just wariness and perhaps a hint of concern. Behind him, a sturdy chestnut horse stood patiently, laden with packs. "You're a long way from anywhere," she said, not lowering the rifle. "I'm a surveyor," he explained. "Working for the railroad, been mapping the pass to the west." His eyes flickered to the gun. "I'm unarmed except for my sidearm, which I'm happy to surrender if it would make you more comfortable." As they stood in this tense standoff, the rain began to fall harder. Thomas let out a wail from inside, and Catherine's resolve wavered. She couldn't hold a rifle and tend to her son at the same time. "If I let you in," she said slowly, "you'll leave at first light." Clayton nodded solemnly. "You have my word, madam." Catherine took a deep breath and stepped back, lowering the rifle slightly. "Come in then, but leave your pistol on the porch." Clayton did as she asked, carefully removing his gun belt and setting it down before gathering some of his packs from the horse. "I'll stable my horse under your lean-to if that's all right." Catherine nodded stiffly. "Be quick about it. The rain's getting worse." While Clayton tended to his horse, Catherine hurried to Thomas, lifting him from his cradle and trying to soothe him. The baby was almost 3 months old now, with a tuft of dark hair like his father's and Catherine's own green eyes. He calmed somewhat in her arms, but still fussed, hungry and disturbed by the storm. By the time Clayton returned, Catherine had seated herself near the fire, Thomas cradled in one arm while she kept the rifle across her lap. Clayton entered, shaking rainwater from his duster before hanging it near the door. He carried several bundles, which he set down carefully. "Thank you for your hospitality, madam," he said, keeping his distance. "I brought some provisions to contribute." He opened one of the packs, revealing dried meat, coffee, and other staples. "You can call me Catherine," she said after a moment. "Katherine Granger, and this is my son, Thomas." Clayton's expression softened as he looked at the infant. "He's a fine-looking boy, Mrs. Granger." "Miss," Catherine corrected automatically, then immediately regretted it. "I mean, I'm widowed." Clayton nodded, no judgment in his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling fire and Thomas's occasional whimpers. Clayton cleared his throat. "May I add some wood to your fire? It's getting chilly, and I noticed your pile is running low." Catherine hesitated, then nodded. She watched as Clayton moved efficiently, adding logs and stoking the fire until it blazed cheerfully, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin. For the first time in months, Catherine felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Having another adult present, even a stranger, alleviated the crushing loneliness she had been enduring. As the evening wore on, Clayton proved to be a respectful guest. He prepared a simple but hearty meal from his provisions, insisting that Catherine eat while he held Thomas after she had reluctantly agreed. To her surprise, the baby seemed content in the stranger's large, capable hands. "You've had experience with children?" she asked, watching him gently bounce her son. Clayton smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "My sister has 4 little ones I visit when I can." "And you're a surveyor?" Catherine took another bite of the venison stew he had prepared. "For the past 5 years," Clayton nodded. "Before that, I rode with a cattle outfit out of Texas. Before that," he shrugged. "A bit of everything. The war left a lot of us drifting." Catherine studied him. He looked to be in his early 30s, which meant he would have been just the right age to fight in the Civil War. "Which side?" she asked quietly. "Union," he replied simply. "Though I don't hold much stock in those divisions anymore, seen too many good men on both sides." The storm intensified as night fell fully, rain lashing at the windows and wind howling through the trees. Clayton had brought his bedroll in and set it up far from Catherine's bed, maintaining a respectful distance that she appreciated. As she nursed Thomas before sleep, she found herself watching Clayton as he meticulously cleaned and checked his surveying equipment. "How long have you been out here, Catherine?" he asked suddenly, without looking up from his work. She stiffened. "Why do you ask?" Clayton glanced up, his expression serious. "Because this cabin isn't meant for winter habitation, especially not with an infant. The gaps in these walls will let in more than just the wind when snow comes." "We manage," Catherine said defensively. Clayton set down his tools and looked at her directly. "I don't mean to pry, but it's clear you're hiding. No wedding ring, though you say you're widowed. No neighbors for miles. A woman alone with a newborn in a barely habitable cabin, jumping at shadows and pointing rifles at strangers. He paused. Are you in some kind of trouble? Catherine looked away, focusing on Thomas's small face as he nursed. It's not your concern, Mr. Galloway. Clayton, please, he sighed. And perhaps it isn't my concern, but if you and your son are in danger, I'd like to help if I can. Why would you help a woman you just met? Catherine asked bitterly. The people I've known for years turned their backs on me. Clayton was quiet for a long moment. Because my mother was once in a situation not unlike yours, he said finally. She had to flee with me and my sister after my father died. People can be cruel when they don't understand something or when they're afraid. Catherine glanced up, surprised by his insight. What happened to her? She found a new community, people who judged her by her actions rather than rumors. She remarried eventually, lived a good life. A shadow crossed his face. But those first years were hard, harder than they needed to be because she was too proud to accept help when it was offered. The cabin fell silent except for the storm and the soft sounds of Thomas finishing his meal. Catherine adjusted her clothing and placed the baby against her shoulder, patting his back gently. The town thinks I killed my husband, she said finally, her voice barely audible above the rain. They think I practice witchcraft because I know which herbs heal and which ones harm. They called me a witch when Thomas was born with a caul over his face. She closed her eyes. My husband died of a fever I couldn't cure. When I found out I was with child, the whispers started. By the time Thomas was born, there was talk of a trial, so I ran. Clayton's expression darkened. Redemption Creek, you said, Catherine nodded. I was the school teacher there, now I'm the witch in the woods. She laughed without humor. Ironic, isn't it? I've never believed in such things, yet here I am, living exactly like the witches in the stories. You're not a witch, Clayton said firmly. You're a mother protecting her child from ignorance and fear. There's nothing more natural than that. Catherine looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. His face was open, honest, with laugh lines around his eyes despite the seriousness of his expression. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His nose had been broken at some point, and his features were too strong to be called refined, but there was a steadiness to him that Catherine found herself drawn to. It's late, she said softly, rising to place Thomas in his cradle. We should get some rest. Clayton nodded, respecting her need to end the conversation. Of course. Good night, Catherine. As she lay in her bed that night, listening to the storm and the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in her cabin, Catherine found herself wondering about Clayton Galloway. He was a stranger, yet in the span of a few hours, she had told him more than she'd spoken to anyone in months. There was something about him that inspired trust, despite her best efforts to remain guarded. Morning came with clearing skies and a stillness that suggested the storm had passed. Catherine woke to find Clayton already up, tending to the fire and preparing coffee. Thomas was awake but quiet in his cradle, seemingly content to watch the stranger move about the cabin. Good morning, Clayton said when he noticed her stirring. Hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of starting breakfast. Those biscuits you had set aside were about to turn, so I figured we should use them. Catherine sat up, momentarily disoriented by the normalcy of the scene. It had been so long since she'd shared a meal with another adult since anyone had cooked for her. Thank you, she managed. They ate in companionable silence, Thomas nestled in Catherine's lap. The baby seemed fascinated by Clayton, watching his every move with wide, curious eyes. When they had finished, Clayton helped clean up, then began gathering his things. Well, as promised, I'll be on my way, he said, though there was a reluctance in his voice that Catherine couldn't help but notice. Yes, of course, she replied, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Once he left, it would be just her and Thomas again, alone against the approaching winter. Clayton moved to the door, then paused, turning back to her. Catherine, I meant what I said last night. I'd like to help if you'll let me. She shook her head. There's nothing you can do. They won't change their minds. Perhaps not, Clayton agreed, but you can't stay here. The winter will be brutal and this cabin won't keep you and Thomas safe. Where would we go? Catherine asked, the desperation she usually kept hidden creeping into her voice. I have no family, no friends who would take us in. Everywhere I go, the rumors will follow. Clayton took a step toward her, his expression determined. I have connections in Denver, people who would hire a teacher without asking too many questions about her past. You could start fresh there. Katherine stared at him, hope and suspicion warring within her. Why would you do this for us? Clayton's gaze dropped to Thomas, then back to Katherine. Because it's the right thing to do, and because he hesitated. Because in the short time I've known you, I've seen a strength and dignity that I admire. You deserve better than hiding in fear. Katherine felt tears threatening and turned away. I can't accept such charity. It's not charity, Clayton insisted. Consider it an investment in your future. In Thomas's future. You can repay me by teaching again, by raising your son to be a good man. He paused. At least let me bring you proper supplies for winter. If you insist on staying, you'll need more than what you have. Katherine looked around the cabin that had been both her prison and sanctuary for the past months. The thought of facing another day here, another week, another month, it was almost unbearable. Yet the thought of trusting this stranger, of placing her and Thomas's fate in his hands, was terrifying in a different way. I need time to think, she said finally. Clayton nodded. Of course, I need to continue my survey work for a few days. I could return in a week with supplies, and you can give me your decision then. It was a reasonable compromise, giving her time to consider while ensuring she wouldn't be completely alone again immediately. Katherine found herself nodding. A week, then. Relief flooded Clayton's face. A week, he confirmed. He hesitated, then reached into his pack and pulled out a revolver smaller than the one he had left outside. Take this, for protection while I'm gone. Katherine eyed the weapon warily. I told you I don't know how to use a gun. Then I'll show you before I leave, Clayton said simply. It's not difficult and it might give you peace of mind. An hour later, after a brief but thorough lesson in handling the revolver, Clayton was ready to depart. He had left her with more provisions than she could have hoped for: coffee, sugar, bacon, and flour, along with ammunition for both her rifle and the pistol. I'll be back in 7 days, he promised, mounting his horse. If anything happens before then, fire 3 shots in the air, I won't be far. Katherine stood in the doorway, Thomas in her arms, watching as Clayton rode away. Only when he had disappeared from view did she realize she had been holding her breath. What do you think, Thomas? She whispered to her son. Can we trust him? Thomas made a small gurgling sound, his tiny hand gripping her finger. I suppose we'll find out, Katherine sighed, turning back to the cabin that suddenly seemed emptier than before. The week passed both quickly and agonizingly slowly for Katherine. With the provisions Clayton had left, she ate better than she had in months. The extra energy allowed her to make improvements to the cabin, patching holes, gathering more firewood, even fashioning a better cradle for Thomas from an old trunk she found in the cabin's small loft. Every day she debated her options. Stay and face the winter alone, or trust Clayton and his offer of help. Both choices terrified her for different reasons. On the 6th day, as Katherine was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 trees near the cabin, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart leapt, thinking Clayton had returned early, but the sound was different: multiple horses, moving quickly. Katherine snatched Thomas from his basket and ran for the cabin, reaching for the revolver Clayton had left her. Through the window, she saw 3 riders approaching, men from Redemption Creek, led by the blacksmith, a hulking man named Silas who had been among the loudest to accuse her of witchcraft. Katherine Granger, Silas bellowed as they reached the clearing. We know you're in there. Come out and face what's coming to you. Katherine's hands trembled as she checked the revolver, making sure it was loaded as Clayton had shown her. Thomas began to cry, frightened by the shouting and his mother's fear. What do you want? Katherine called back, trying to keep her voice steady. Justice? Another voice answered: Martin, the shopkeeper who had refused to sell her supplies after her husband died. Cattle are dying in town, crops failing. It's your doing, which Katherine almost laughed at the absurdity. She had been gone for months. How could she possibly be responsible for their misfortunes? I've done nothing to you or your town, she replied. Leave us in peace, the boy, Silas called. Give us the witch child. We'll spare you if you give him up. Ice flooded Katherine's veins. Never, she whispered, then louder. Never, get off my land. She heard the men dismounting, their boots heavy on the hard ground. Thomas wailed louder and Catherine's mind raced. She could fire the gun, but there were 3 of them. Even if she managed to hit one, the others would overwhelm her. In desperation, she remembered Clayton's instructions. 3 shots in the air, but he wasn't due back until tomorrow. He might be too far away to hear. As the men approached the cabin, Katherine made her decision. Holding Thomas close with one arm, she raised the revolver with her free hand and fired 3 shots through the open window, straight up into the sky. The gunshots momentarily startled the men, and they drew their own weapons. "That was foolish, Katherine," Silas called. "There's no one to help you out here." Katherine backed away from the window, moving to the corner of the cabin furthest from the door. She had 1 bullet left in the revolver, and the rifle was loaded, though she doubted her ability to use it effectively while holding Thomas. "Please," she prayed silently, "please let Clayton be close enough to hear." The men were at the door now. Katherine could hear them discussing how to break in. "Stand back," Silas ordered, and Katherine knew he was about to kick in the door. The first impact shook the entire cabin. Thomas screamed, and Katherine held him tighter, whispering desperate reassurances. The second kick splintered the simple latch. 1 more would break it entirely, but the third kick never came. Instead, Katherine heard a new voice, calm, authoritative, and familiar. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, gentlemen." Clayton's voice sent a wave of relief through Katherine so intense she nearly collapsed. "This isn't your business, stranger," Silas growled. "Move along." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Clayton replied evenly. "The lady and her child are under my protection." There was a tense silence, and Katherine moved cautiously to the window, peering out. Clayton sat atop his horse, his rifle aimed steadily at the 3 men. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a dangerous intensity that even Katherine could see from a distance. "You're outnumbered," Martin pointed out. Clayton didn't even blink. "Maybe, but I guarantee I'll take at least 2 of you with me. Who wants to be first?" The men shifted uncomfortably, looking at each other. None seemed eager to test Clayton's marksmanship. "We just want the witch and her demon child," the third man said, a young farmer named Illy whom Katherine had once thought friendly. Clayton's expression hardened further. "That witch is a widow and a mother. That demon is an innocent baby, and if any of you take 1 more step toward this cabin, you'll answer to me." Katherine could see the men weighing their options. 3 against 1 were good odds, but something in Clayton's demeanor suggested he was no stranger to violence. The steady way he held his rifle, the calm in his voice despite the threat in his words, these were not the traits of a man who made idle threats. "This isn't over," Silas finally said, backing away. "We'll be back with more men." "I'll be waiting," Clayton promised, his rifle never wavering. "Now get on your horses and ride back to town, and spread the word. Anyone who threatens Katherine Granger or her son will regret it." The men mounted up, glaring at Clayton as they did. Only when they had ridden well out of sight did Clayton lower his rifle and dismount, hurrying to the cabin. "Katherine," he called through the damaged door, "are you all right?" Katherine rushed to open what remained of the door, relief making her knees weak. "We're unharmed," she managed, clutching Thomas to her chest. Clayton's eyes swept over them both, checking for injuries despite her assurance. Only when he was satisfied did some of the tension leave his shoulders. "I heard your shots. I was already on my way back, thankful I decided to come a day early." "Thank God you did," Katherine breathed. She stepped back, inviting him in. "Thank you, Clayton. You saved our lives." Clayton entered, immediately moving to examine the damaged door. "This won't hold if they come back," he said grimly. "And they will come back with more men next time." Katherine sank onto a chair, suddenly exhausted as the fear that had been sustaining her ebbed away. "What are we going to do?" Clayton turned to her, his expression resolute. "We need to leave. Tonight, it's not safe for you here anymore." "Leave? But where?" "Denver, like I suggested," Clayton interrupted. "But first we need to get you somewhere safe for the night. I have a camp set up about 5 miles from here. We'll go there, rest, and then set out for Denver tomorrow." Katherine looked around the cabin that had been her refuge for the past months. The thought of leaving was terrifying, but staying had become impossible. "How long will it take to reach Denver?" 4, maybe 5 days of riding," Clayton answered. "I have a wagon cached near my camp." It's not comfortable, but it will get us there. Us, Catherine looked up, surprised. You're coming with us, Clayton knelt before her, his eyes serious. Catherine, I made you a promise protection. I intend to keep that promise. I'll see you and Thomas safely to Denver, help you get established. After that, he hesitated. After that, if you wish me to go, I will. Catherine studied his face, seeing nothing but sincerity in his expression. Slowly, she nodded. All right, we'll go with you. Relief flooded Clayton's features. We should hurry. Gather only what you absolutely need, clothes for you and Thomas, any valuables or mementos you can't bear to leave behind. I'll repair the door as best I can to buy us time. As Catherine moved about the cabin, packing her meager belongings, she marveled at how quickly her life had changed. A week ago, she had been resigned to facing the winter alone. Now she was preparing to flee with a man she barely knew, placing all her trust in his promise of protection. Yet as she watched Clayton work, efficiently securing the door and gathering his own supplies, she realized that she did trust him, more than she had trusted anyone since her husband's death. There was something solid about Clayton Galloway, a dependability that went beyond words. Within an hour, they were ready to leave. Catherine had packed a small bundle of clothes, her wedding ring, a locket containing a lock of her husband's hair, and a few books she couldn't bear to part with. Thomas was wrapped warmly, dozing against her chest in a sling Clayton had fashioned from one of his spare shirts. Ready? Clayton asked, leading his horse closer to the cabin. Catherine took one last look at the place that had been both her prison and sanctuary. Ready, she confirmed. Clayton helped her mount his horse, then led them away from the cabin, walking alongside rather than riding to spare the animal the extra weight. As they traveled through the gathering dusk, Catherine found herself relaxing incrementally, the tension of the past months beginning to dissolve in the face of Clayton's steady presence. Tell me about Denver, she said after they had been traveling for some time. What is it like? Clayton glanced up at her, a small smile playing at his lips. Growing faster than anyone can believe. New buildings going up every day. It's rough in parts like any frontier city, but there are good people there. Schools that need teachers, churches, theaters, proper shops. And your connections, the ones who might help me find work. A family I helped during a difficult time, Clayton explained. Horace and Mabel Jenkins. He owns a stationery and bookshop, and she runs a small private school for girls. They've been looking for another teacher. Catherine felt a flutter of hope. Teaching again, the thought was almost too wonderful to contemplate. Do you think they would accept me given my situation? Clayton nodded firmly. Mabel is not one to judge others. She'll see your worth quickly enough. He paused, then added more quietly, and if anyone asks, we can say we're married. A widow remarried is less likely to face scrutiny than an unmarried mother. Catherine stiffened slightly. I couldn't ask you to pretend, it's just a suggestion, Clayton said quickly. For your protection and Thomas's, nothing more. They fell silent after that, each lost in their own thoughts as they made their way through the darkening forest. By the time they reached Clayton's camp, night had fallen completely. The camp was well established with a small tent, a fire pit lined with stones, and various supplies neatly arranged. It's not much, Clayton apologized, helping Catherine down from the horse, but it will do for the night. He quickly built a fire, then showed Catherine to the tent. You and Thomas take the tent, I'll sleep by the fire. Catherine started to protest, but Clayton held up a hand. I insist, you need proper rest more than I do. After a simple meal of jerky and hardtack softened with coffee, Catherine retreated to the tent with Thomas. The small space was clean and surprisingly comfortable, with a bedroll made of several blankets layered together. Clayton had even hung a small lantern from the center pole, providing a soft, warm light. As she settled Thomas beside her, Catherine found herself thinking about Clayton's suggestion that they pretend to be married. It was a practical solution, one that would shield both her and Thomas from prying questions and judgment. Yet something about it troubled her, not the idea itself, but the casual way Clayton had offered it, as if such a pretense would mean nothing to him. Outside, she could hear Clayton moving about the camp, checking on the horse, adding wood to the fire. The sounds were comforting after so many months of solitude. Eventually, they stopped, and Katherine imagined Clayton sitting by the fire, perhaps looking up at the stars. Sleep came easier than she expected, wrapped in the security of Clayton's protection. Morning arrived with a gentle touch on her shoulder. Katherine opened her eyes to find Clayton kneeling at the tent entrance, a steaming cup in his hand. "Coffee," he said, offering it to her. "We should get moving soon. If those men return to your cabin and find you gone, they might start searching." Katherine sat up carefully, trying not to disturb Thomas, who was still sleeping peacefully. "Thank you," she said, accepting the coffee. It was strong and sweet, exactly what she needed to face the day ahead. While she drank, Clayton outlined their journey. "We'll head northwest first, away from Redemption Creek, then circle back toward Denver. It will add a day to our journey, but it's safer than taking the direct route where we might encounter search parties." Katherine nodded, appreciating his caution. "What about supplies? I didn't bring much food." "I have enough to get us to the next town," Clayton assured her, "and I have money to buy what we need along the way." Once they had eaten and packed the camp, Clayton led Katherine to where he had hidden the wagon, a small, sturdy buckboard with a canvas cover, pulled by a patient-looking mule. "Not exactly a fine carriage," Clayton said with a rueful smile, "but it will get us to Denver." "It's perfect," Katherine replied honestly. After months in the isolated cabin, even this simple wagon represented freedom and possibility. Clayton helped her up onto the seat, then handed Thomas to her before climbing up himself. With a click of his tongue and a light flick of the reins, they set off, leaving behind the forest that had been Katherine's refuge and prison. The first day of travel passed uneventfully. Clayton kept them to lesser-known trails, avoiding the main roads where they might be seen. He was a skilled driver, handling the wagon with ease over the rough terrain. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or tell stories of his surveying work, his deep voice a pleasant counterpoint to the steady creaking of the wagon. Katherine found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the strong profile, the capable hands, the quiet confidence in his movements. He was unlike any man she had known before, including her late husband. There was a stillness to Clayton, a self-containment that suggested depths she could only guess at. They made camp that night in a sheltered valley, far from any roads or settlements. As they sat by the fire after supper, Thomas asleep in a makeshift bed of blankets, Clayton finally asked the question Katherine had been dreading. "Your husband," he said quietly. "How did he die?" Katherine stared into the flames. "Pneumonia. It came on suddenly after he was caught in a spring storm. I tried everything I knew, herbs, poultices, steam. Nothing helped." She swallowed hard. "He was delirious at the end, calling out names I didn't recognize. When he died, I was alone with him." "I'm sorry," Clayton said, and she could hear the genuine sympathy in his voice. "It's a hard thing to lose someone you love." "The hardest part came after," Katherine continued, finding relief in finally telling someone the full story. "People started whispering that I hadn't tried hard enough to save him, that perhaps I didn't want to save him. When I discovered I was with child, the whispers grew louder. They said I had used dark arts to conceive, that the child couldn't be my husband since he had been ill for weeks before his death. People fear what they don't understand," Clayton said, "and grief makes them look for someone to blame." "Then Thomas was born with a caul over his face," Katherine went on. "The midwife, an old woman who had delivered half the town, she crossed herself and refused to touch him again. She told everyone it was a sign that he was marked by the devil." Katherine's voice broke. "He was just a baby." "An innocent, perfect baby." Clayton moved closer, not quite touching her but offering his presence as comfort. "What happened then?" "I heard them planning," Katherine whispered. "The preacher, the mayor, some of the townsmen, they were going to take Thomas from me, declare me unfit. There was talk of a trial, of testing me the old way, binding me and throwing me in the creek to see if I floated." She shuddered. "So I ran, I took what I could carry and fled in the night." "You did the right thing," Clayton said firmly. "You protected your son." Katherine looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Sometimes I wonder if I should have stood my ground, demanded justice. But then I look at Thomas and I know I couldn't risk it." Clayton's hand found hers in the darkness, his touch warm and reassuring. Courage isn't always about standing and fighting. Sometimes it's about knowing when to retreat, to live and fight another day. He squeezed her hand gently. You're the bravest woman I've ever met, Katherine Granger. Katherine felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. Clayton's words, his touch, the earnest look in his eyes, they affected her in ways she hadn't experienced in a very long time. She found herself wanting to lean into him, to rest her head on his shoulder and let him hold her. Instead, she carefully withdrew her hand. Thank you, she said softly. For understanding, for helping us. Clayton nodded, accepting her withdrawal without comment. We should get some rest. Tomorrow will be another long day. That night, as Katherine lay in the small tent with Thomas, she found herself thinking about Clayton in ways that both excited and frightened her. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to feel anything beyond fear and determination to survive. The stirrings of attraction, of something that might grow into more given time and nurturing, were unexpected and unsettling. It's too soon, she whispered to herself, and he's a stranger still. But as she drifted towards sleep, Katherine couldn't help wondering if perhaps fate had sent Clayton Galloway to her cabin door for reasons beyond simple protection. The second day of travel brought them into more populated areas. Clayton remained vigilant, scanning the horizon frequently for any sign of pursuit. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small trading post where Clayton purchased additional supplies: flour, beans, salt pork, and to Katherine's delight, a small bag of hard candies. For when the journey gets tedious, he explained with a smile, offering her one of the brightly colored sweets. The simple gesture touched Katherine deeply. It had been so long since anyone had thought to give her a gift, however small. She savored the candy as they continued their journey, the sweet taste a welcome counterpoint to the dust of the trail. That evening, as they made camp near a small stream, Clayton surprised her again by producing a thin book from his pack, a collection of poetry by Tennyson. I thought you might enjoy something to read, he said, almost shy as he handed it to her. I noticed your books when you were packing. Katherine ran her fingers over the worn leather cover. You read poetry? She asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Clayton chuckled. Does that seem out of character for a rough surveyor? Perhaps a little, Katherine admitted with a small smile. My mother insisted on education, even after we left our home, Clayton explained. She taught us herself when there was no school available. Said that books were windows to worlds we might never see otherwise. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Clayton agreed, a note of old sorrow in his voice. She passed 5 years ago, influenza. Katherine reached out impulsively, touching his arm. I'm sorry for your loss. Clayton covered her hand with his, and for a moment they sat in companionable silence, connected by shared grief and understanding. Then Thomas began to fuss, breaking the moment. As Katherine tended to her son, she found herself wondering more about Clayton's past. He spoke of his mother with evident love and respect, but he rarely mentioned his father. She wanted to ask, but hesitated to pry into what might be painful memories. He's growing, Clayton observed, watching as Katherine changed Thomas's diaper. Strong boy. Yes, Katherine agreed, pride evident in her voice. He's already trying to hold his head up. The doctor in town said he was developing quickly. You'll need to find a good physician in Denver, Clayton said. There are several reputable ones, Dr. Matthews is particularly well regarded, especially for children. The casual way Clayton spoke of their future in Denver, as if it were already settled, both comforted and unsettled Katherine. It made the abstract idea of starting over in a new city feel real, tangible. Clayton, she said hesitantly, what will happen when we reach Denver? Will you simply leave us with your friends and continue on your way? Clayton looked at her, his expression serious. Is that what you want me to do? Katherine bit her lip. I don't know what I want, she admitted. Everything has happened so quickly. A week ago, I was resigned to spending the winter alone in that cabin. Now I'm traveling to a city I've never seen with a man I barely know. You're right to be cautious, Clayton acknowledged. We are still strangers in many ways. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I can promise you this. I will see you safely to Denver, help you get established, and then the choice will be yours. If you wish me to go, I will respect that. If you wish me to stay. He left the sentence unfinished. It was an honorable answer, giving her control over her own future. Yet Katherine found herself hoping that by the time they reached Denver, she would know with certainty whether she wanted Clayton to remain in her life. The third day of their journey was marked by an increasing tension. Twice, Clayton spotted riders in the distance and altered their course to avoid being seen. Katherine could sense his growing concern, though he tried to hide it from her. "They're looking for us, aren't they?" she asked as they made a detour through a narrow canyon. Clayton didn't insult her intelligence by denying it. Possibly, those men from town were determined. They may have gathered more men to search. "Why do they hate me so much?" Katherine wondered aloud, the question that had haunted her for months finally finding voice. Clayton was silent for a long moment. "Fear," he said finally. "Fear and ignorance. In hard times, people look for something, someone to blame. A woman who keeps to herself, who knows more about herbs and healing than most, who lives differently than they think she should. You're an easy target. But to chase me this far, to risk their own lives. Once people convince themselves that someone is evil, they can justify almost anything," Clayton said grimly. "They believe they're protecting their community. They probably think they're doing God's work." The words chilled Katherine, reminding her of the preacher's sermons in the weeks before she fled fire and brimstone, warnings about witchcraft in their midst, calls for vigilance against the devil's servants. "What if they find us?" she asked quietly. Clayton's hand moved to the rifle beside him on the wagon seat. "They won't take you or Thomas, I swear it." The fierce protectiveness in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, Katherine found it deeply reassuring. In the short time they had known each other, Clayton had become her shield against a world that had turned hostile. That night, Clayton insisted they make a cold camp, no fire, minimal movement, staying as hidden as possible. They ate a cheerless meal of jerky and hardtack, speaking in whispers as darkness fell. Thomas was unusually fussy, perhaps sensing the tension, and Katherine walked him back and forth near the wagon, singing softly to soothe him. "You have a beautiful voice," Clayton said when she finally returned, Thomas asleep in her arms. "My mother sang," Katherine told him, carefully settling Thomas in his makeshift bed. "Lullabies, hymns, old folk songs. Some of my earliest memories are of her singing while she worked." "What happened to her?" Clayton asked gently. "She and my father both died of typhoid when I was 16, Katherine said. "I went to live with my aunt in St. Louis. She's the one who insisted I train as a teacher, said it was respectable work for a woman who needed to support herself." "She was right about that," Clayton agreed. "Though I imagine you're a teacher because you love it, not just for the security." Katherine smiled, surprised and pleased by his insight. "Yes, I've always loved learning, sharing knowledge. Seeing a child's face light up when they understand something new, there's nothing quite like it." "You'll have that again in Denver," Clayton promised. "Mabel Jenkins will recognize your passion. She feels the same way about education." They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their pasts in hushed voices. Clayton told her about his years driving cattle, about the places he had surveyed, about the sister who lived in California with her brood of children. Katherine spoke of her brief time teaching in St. Louis before coming west with her husband, of their dreams for a future that had been cut short by his illness. As the night grew colder, Clayton noticed Katherine shivering and wordlessly draped his coat around her shoulders. The weight of it was comforting, the fabric still warm from his body. It smelled of him leather, tobacco, and something indefinably masculine. "We should try to sleep," Clayton finally said, though neither made a move to separate. "Clayton," Katherine said suddenly, gathering her courage. "If we reach Denver safely, if your friends help us get established, would you consider staying? Not pretending to be married, but nearby, at least for a while." In the darkness, she couldn't clearly see his expression, but she felt the slight tension that went through him at her words. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I think so," Katherine admitted. "Thomas and we've grown used to having you around, and She hesitated, uncertain how to express the complicated feelings developing within her. "I trust you," she finished simply. Clayton was quiet for so long that Katherine began to worry she had overstepped, revealed too much too soon. But then his hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I would like that very much," he said softly. To stay. To see what might develop between us, given time and freedom from fear. Catherine's heart quickened at his words, at the gentle pressure of his hand holding hers. In that moment, she could imagine a future beyond running and hiding, a future that included Clayton Galloway. Their moment of connection was shattered by the distant sound of horses approaching. Clayton was on his feet instantly, pulling Catherine up with him. "They've found us," he said, his voice taut with tension. "Quick, into the wagon, stay down and keep Thomas quiet." Catherine didn't waste time with questions. She gathered Thomas, still miraculously asleep, and climbed into the wagon, crouching low beneath the canvas cover. Clayton moved with practiced efficiency, hitching the mule and gathering their essential belongings. Within minutes they were moving, the wagon rolling as quietly as possible through the darkness. Clayton had doused their small lantern, navigating by the faint light of the stars and a slim crescent moon. "Where are we going?" Catherine whispered, clutching Thomas to her chest. "There's a place about 3 miles from here, an old mining claim, abandoned now. The entrance to the mine itself is still accessible. We can hide there until they pass." The terrain grew rougher as Clayton guided the wagon away from the trail and into the wild country beyond. Catherine braced herself against the sides of the wagon, trying to keep Thomas from being jostled awake. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of pursuit growing louder, men's voices calling to each other, the clash of metal as guns or tools struck against saddles. When the wagon could go no further, Clayton halted and helped Catherine down. "We'll have to continue on foot," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's not far, but the path is steep. Can you carry Thomas?" Catherine nodded, adjusting her grip on her son. Clayton gathered a small pack of supplies, his rifle and a lantern which he left unlit. Taking Catherine's free hand, he led her up a narrow path that would have been treacherous even in daylight. The abandoned mine appeared suddenly a dark opening in the side of the hill, partially obscured by overgrown brush. Clayton pushed aside the vegetation and guided Catherine inside, following close behind. Only when they were several yards into the mine did Clayton risk lighting the lantern, keeping the flame turned low. The faint light revealed a tunnel shored up with old timber, extending into darkness ahead of them. "We should be safe here," Clayton said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "They won't think to look in an abandoned mine." Catherine leaned against the rough wall, trying to catch her breath. The adrenaline that had sustained her during their flight was ebbing, leaving her shaky and exhausted. Thomas, miraculously, was still asleep, though she knew that wouldn't last much longer. Clayton set down his pack and the lantern, then moved back to the mine entrance, listening intently. After a few minutes, he returned to Catherine's side. "They're searching the area where we camped," he reported, "but they seem uncertain which direction we took." "How long will we need to stay here?" Catherine asked, looking around nervously at their temporary refuge. "Until dawn at least," Clayton answered. "Then we can assess whether it's safe to continue." He glanced at Thomas. "Is he all right?" Catherine nodded, "still sleeping, though he'll be hungry soon." As if on cue, Thomas began to stir, making small sounds of displeasure at being awakened in strange surroundings. Catherine quickly sat down on a relatively flat rock, adjusting her clothing to nurse him. Clayton respectfully turned away, moving further into the mine to explore their temporary shelter. The lantern light danced across the rough walls as he moved, revealing abandoned tools and equipment scattered about. "Looks like they left in a hurry," he commented, examining a pickaxe still embedded in the wall. "Probably when the silver ran out." Catherine only half listened, her attention focused on Thomas, who was now nursing contentedly. The simple act of feeding her child calmed her, reminding her that despite everything, some aspects of life continued normally. When Thomas had finished, Catherine adjusted her clothing and stood, moving carefully to join Clayton deeper in the mine. "Find anything useful?" she asked. "Some old blankets, surprisingly not too rotted," Clayton replied, indicating a small pile of fabric he had gathered. "And there's a side chamber up ahead that's relatively dry. We can rest there." The chamber Clayton had found was indeed more comfortable than the main tunnel, a natural widening in the mine where the miners had apparently taken their meals and rested between shifts. There was even an old stove, long cold but still intact. Clayton arranged the salvaged blankets into a makeshift pallet. "It's not ideal," he apologized, "but it should be more comfortable than the ground." "Thank you," Katherine said, genuinely grateful. She settled onto the blankets with Thomas, who was beginning to fuss again after his meal. Clayton sat nearby, his rifle across his knees. In the dim lantern light, his face looked harder, more weathered, the face of a man accustomed to danger and prepared to meet it. "You've done this before," Katherine said suddenly, the realization dawning on her. "Hidden, run, protected someone." Clayton glanced at her, then looked away. "Yes," he admitted after a moment. "During the war and after, I worked for the Pinkerton Agency for a while, guarding payrolls, sometimes people." It explained so much: his competence in crisis, his strategic thinking, the way he handled weapons with such ease. "Why didn't you tell me?" "It's not a part of my life I talk about much," Clayton said. "Some of the things I did, they weren't always clean or straightforward. The law and justice don't always align, especially out here." "Is that why you became a surveyor, to leave that life behind?" Clayton nodded slowly. "Partly. And because I was tired of cities, of people. The wilderness doesn't lie or betray, it's harsh sometimes, but honest. Yet here you are, helping a stranger, involving yourself in my troubles," Katherine observed. "Why, Clayton? The truth, please." Clayton was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "Because from the moment I saw you standing in that cabin doorway, rifle in your hands, protecting your child with everything you had, I knew you were someone worth protecting, someone worth knowing." He met her eyes directly. "Someone worth changing my solitary ways for." The simple honesty of his words took Katherine's breath away. In that moment, despite the danger surrounding them, despite the uncertainty of their future, she felt something she had thought lost forever: hope, and the stirrings of something that might, given time, become love. "Clayton," she began, but was cut off by the sound of voices echoing from the mine entrance. Clayton was on his feet instantly, dousing the lantern and moving to shield Katherine and Thomas with his body. "Stay here," he whispered. "Don't make a sound." He moved silently toward the main tunnel, rifle ready. Katherine held Thomas close, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give them away. The voices grew louder, and Katherine could make out fragments of conversation. Waste of time. Tracks led this way. No one would hide in an old mine. Check anyway. A beam of light appeared, bobbing along the main tunnel, a lantern carried by one of the searchers. Clayton pressed himself against the wall just outside their chamber, waiting. Katherine could see his silhouette, tense and ready. The light grew brighter as the searcher approached. Katherine held her breath, one hand gently covering Thomas's mouth to keep him quiet. The baby, sensing her tension, remained eerily still. The searcher paused at the junction of the main tunnel and their side chamber. For one terrible moment, Katherine thought he would turn and discover them, but then a voice called from the entrance, "Illy, come on, Silas says we're moving on." The searcher hesitated, then called back, "Coming." The light receded as he turned and headed back toward the entrance. Katherine released her breath slowly, careful not to make a sound. Clayton remained motionless for several minutes, listening intently. Only when the voices had completely faded did he return to her side. "They're gone for now," he whispered, "but they might come back. We should stay here until dawn, then slip away while they're still searching other areas." Katherine nodded, trembling slightly from the close call. Clayton sat beside her on the blankets, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body but not quite touching her. "Try to rest," he advised. "I'll keep watch." "You need sleep too," Katherine protested. Clayton smiled faintly. "I've gone longer without sleep. I'll be fine." Despite her fears, exhaustion eventually overcame Katherine. With Thomas cradled securely against her chest and Clayton's solid presence beside her, she drifted into a fitful sleep. She woke to Clayton's gentle touch on her shoulder. "Katherine," he whispered, "it's time to go." The lantern was lit again, turned low. Clayton had already packed their few belongings. Outside, Katherine could see the faintest lightening of the sky through the mine entrance. "Any sign of them?" she asked, carefully sitting up to avoid disturbing Thomas, who was still sleeping. "None," Clayton confirmed, "but we should move quickly." I want to put as much distance between us and them as possible before full daylight. They emerged from the mine into the gray light of pre-dawn. The air was crisp and cool, scented with pine and sage. Clayton led them back down the path to where they had left the wagon, moving cautiously and pausing frequently to listen for any sound of pursuit. The wagon was undisturbed, the mule grazing peacefully nearby. Clayton quickly hitched the animal, then helped Katherine and Thomas aboard. "We'll avoid the main trails today," he said as he took up the reins. "It will slow us down, but it's safer." Katherine nodded, settling Thomas more comfortably in her lap. "How much farther to Denver? If we push hard, we could reach the outskirts by tomorrow evening," Clayton replied. "But given our need for caution, it might take another day." As they set off, Katherine found herself watching Clayton's profile, struck again by the strength and determination evident in every line of his face. In the short time they had known each other, he had risked his life for her and Thomas without hesitation. Such selflessness was rare, especially in a world that had taught Katherine to expect the worst from people. "Thank you," she said softly. Clayton glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "For everything," Katherine clarified, "for helping us, for not giving up when things became dangerous." A small smile touched Clayton's lips. "No thanks needed. I made you a promise. I intend to keep it." The simplicity of his words, the quiet integrity behind them, touched Katherine deeply. In a world that had shown her so much cruelty, Clayton Galloway represented something she had almost stopped believing in: goodness, pure and uncomplicated. The day passed slowly as they wound their way through back country, avoiding roads and settlements. Clayton's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable as he guided them through passes and valleys that weren't on any map Katherine had seen. By mid-afternoon, the landscape began to change, becoming more open as they descended from the foothills toward the plains where Denver was situated. In the distance, Katherine could see the smoke of the city, a smudge on the horizon that represented both safety and a new beginning. "We'll stop for the night soon," Clayton said as the sun began to lower in the west. "There's a spot about an hour from here, a small grove by a creek. Good water, plenty of cover." Katherine nodded, shifting Thomas to her other arm. The baby had been remarkably good-natured throughout the journey, adapting to the constant movement of the wagon with resilience that surprised her. "He's a strong boy," Clayton observed, noticing her adjustment. "Takes after his mother." Katherine smiled, pleased by the compliment. "I hope he grows up to be as brave and kind as you," she replied, the words coming naturally. Clayton's hands tightened momentarily on the reins, and Katherine saw a flash of emotion cross his face: surprise, pleasure, and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to name. "That's a fine compliment," he said finally, his voice slightly rough. "Thank you." They reached the grove as twilight was settling, the trees casting long shadows across the ground. Clayton quickly established their camp, building a small, sheltered fire and preparing a simple but nourishing meal from their supplies. As they ate, Katherine found herself imagining a future where such domestic scenes were commonplace: she and Clayton sharing meals, raising Thomas together, building a life that included safety and happiness. It was a dangerous fantasy, she knew. They had known each other less than 2 weeks. Yet she couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them, forged in danger and strengthened by mutual respect. "What will you do?" she asked suddenly. "After you've seen us safely to Denver, if you stayed as we discussed, what would you do?" Clayton considered the question seriously. "The railroad always needs surveyors, and Denver's growing so quickly that there's plenty of work for a man willing to do it. I've saved most of my earnings over the years, enough to establish a more permanent base if I had reason to." The implication was clear, though delicately stated. Clayton was offering to change his wandering ways to set down roots for her and Thomas. "And would you be content with that?" Katherine pressed. "After years of freedom, of answering to no one but yourself," Clayton's gaze met hers across the fire, steady and honest. "Freedom isn't just about movement, Katherine. Sometimes it's about choosing where and with whom to remain still." The quiet wisdom of his words resonated deeply with her. Her marriage, though loving, had been arranged quickly after her parents' deaths, a practical solution to her sudden vulnerability as a young woman alone in the world. She had grown to love her husband, but there had always been an element of necessity to their union. With Clayton, everything was different. There was no practical need for him to help her, to protect her, to consider building a life that included her and Thomas. He did these things by choice, freely offered. "I think," Katherine said slowly, carefully choosing her words, "that when we reach Denver I would like very much for you to stay. Not as a pretend husband, but as a friend. For now, with the possibility of more as we come to know each other better." Clayton's expression softened, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "I would like that very much," he said simply. That night, as Katherine prepared for sleep, she found herself thinking of the future with a hope she had not felt since before her husband's illness. Denver represented not just safety from the men of Redemption Creek, but the possibility of a new life, one that might include Clayton Galloway. The final day of their journey dawned clear and bright. Clayton was already up when Katherine emerged from the tent, tending to the mule and preparing coffee. Thomas, who had woken early, was cradled in one of Clayton's arms, looking up at the tall man with evident fascination. "Hope you don't mind," Clayton said when he noticed Katherine watching them. "He was fussing and you were still sleeping so soundly." Katherine shook her head, oddly touched by the sight of her son in Clayton's careful hold. "I don't mind at all. He seems to like you." "Smart boy," Clayton replied with a wink. "He knows who brings the supplies." The easy banter between them continued as they broke camp and resumed their journey. With Denver now visible in the distance, a weight seemed to have lifted from both of them. The threat of pursuit had faded with each mile they put between themselves and Redemption Creek. By late afternoon, they were approaching the outskirts of the city. Katherine stared in wonder at the bustling activity wagons and carriages moving along proper streets, buildings made of brick and stone, people of all descriptions going about their business. "It's so much bigger than I imagined," she said, taking in the sight of Denver spread before them. "And growing every day," Clayton agreed. "The railroad's bringing new people constantly. It's a city of opportunity now." He guided the wagon through the outskirts and into the city proper, navigating the increasingly crowded streets with confidence. Katherine held Thomas close, both protecting him from the dust and noise and anchoring herself as she faced this new beginning. Clayton finally halted the wagon in front of a substantial brick building with a sign that read Jenkins Stationery and Books. Beside it was a smaller structure with a painted sign identifying it as Mabel Jenkins School for Young Ladies. "We're here," Clayton announced, setting the brake and turning to Katherine with a reassuring smile. "Ready to meet your future employers?" Katherine smoothed her travel-worn dress as best she could and adjusted Thomas in her arms. "Do I look presentable?" she asked nervously. After days on the road, Clayton's gaze traveled over her face, his expression softening. "You look beautiful," he said simply, "like a woman who has faced hardship with courage and dignity." Before Katherine could respond to the unexpected compliment, the door of the bookshop opened, and a portly, bearded man emerged, followed by a tall, spare woman with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Clayton Galloway, as I live and breathe." The man exclaimed, approaching the wagon with arms outstretched. "Mabel, look who's finally returned to civilization." Clayton climbed down from the wagon and clasped the man's hand warmly. "Horace, good to see you, and Mabel, you're looking well as ever." The woman sniffed, but there was affection in her eyes as she regarded Clayton. "Still wandering the wilderness, I see, though not alone this time." Her sharp gaze had already taken in Katherine and Thomas. Clayton turned back to the wagon, reaching up to help Katherine down. "Horace, Mabel, I'd like you to meet Katherine Granger and her son Thomas. Katherine, these are my friends Horace and Mabel Jenkins." Katherine balanced Thomas carefully as she offered her free hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you both. Clayton has told me so much about you." Mabel took her hand, her grip firm and assessing. "Has he now? I wonder what tales he's been spinning." But there was a twinkle in her eye that belied her stern tone. Horace was already cooing at Thomas, his round face alight with delight. "What a fine boy, how old is he?" "Just over 3 months," Katherine replied, relaxing slightly at the genuine warmth of their reception. "Well, you must both be exhausted from your journey," Mabel declared, taking charge. "Come inside at once. I've just put on a pot of tea and there's stew for supper." As they entered the Jenkins' comfortable home behind the bookshop, Catherine felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. After months of fear and isolation, after days of dangerous travel, they had reached safety. More than that, they had found what seemed to be a genuine welcome. Mabel showed Catherine to a small but clean bedroom where she could refresh herself and tend to Thomas. There was even a cradle ready, as if they had been expecting a baby all along. "Clayton sent word ahead," Mabel explained, seeing Catherine's surprise. "Just a brief telegram saying he was bringing a young widow and her infant who needed a fresh start. We've had the room ready for 3 days." Catherine turned to her, overcome with emotion. "Mrs. Jenkins, I don't know how to thank you for such kindness to strangers." Mabel's stern face softened. "My dear, Clayton Galloway doesn't vouch for just anyone. If he says you're worthy of help, that's good enough for me and Horace." She paused. "And it's Mabel, please. We don't stand on ceremony here." After washing away the dust of travel and changing Thomas's diaper, Catherine joined the others in the cozy kitchen. Clayton was seated at the table with Horace, deep in conversation, while Mabel busied herself at the stove. The domestic scene was so normal, so welcoming, that Catherine felt a lump form in her throat. "Ah, here she is," Horace beamed, rising to pull out a chair for her. "Sit, sit. Mabel's stew is legendary in these parts." Throughout the meal, Catherine answered Mabel's practical questions about her education and teaching experience, while deflecting more personal inquiries with vague responses. Clayton had evidently explained enough of her situation that the Jenkins didn't press too hard, accepting her reticence with understanding. "Well," Mabel announced as they finished their dessert of apple pie, "it just so happens that Miss Winters, my assistant teacher, has recently become engaged and will be leaving at the end of the month. The timing couldn't be better. You can observe classes for a week or two, get a feel for our curriculum, and then step in when she departs." Catherine stared at her, hardly daring to believe it could be so simple. "You're offering me a position, without references, without knowing more about me." Mabel fixed her with a keen gaze. "My dear, I've been teaching for 40 years. I know a natural educator when I see one. The way you explain things to Thomas, even though he's far too young to understand, that's the mark of a teacher." And Horace added with a twinkle, "Clayton's word is better than any reference letter." Catherine looked at Clayton, who had been quietly observing the conversation. The warmth in his eyes, the slight smile on his lips, they conveyed his pleasure at seeing his promise fulfilled. She had a home, a job, a future in Denver, all because this man had knocked on her cabin door during a storm. Later that evening, after Thomas had been settled in the cradle and the Jenkins had retired, Catherine found Clayton on the small porch behind the house, smoking a cigarette and looking at the stars. "I can never thank you enough," she said, joining him. "For bringing us here, for arranging all this." Clayton extinguished his cigarette and turned to her. "No thanks needed. Seeing you and Thomas safe with a future ahead of you, that's all the gratitude I require." "And what about your future?" Catherine asked, stepping closer to him. "You mentioned staying in Denver, finding work here." "I meant what I said," Clayton affirmed. "If you want me to stay, to be part of your and Thomas's lives, I'd like nothing better." In the dim light of the porch lantern, Catherine studied his face, the strength and kindness written there, the steady gaze that had never wavered since the moment he promised her protection. "I want you to stay," she said simply. "Not out of obligation or duty, but because." She hesitated, then gathered her courage. "Because I believe there could be something wonderful between us, given time." Clayton's expression softened, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he gently touched her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. "Katherine Granger," he said softly, "from the moment I saw you standing in that cabin doorway, rifle in hand, protecting your son with the fierceness of a mother bear, I knew you were remarkable. Everything I've learned about you since has only confirmed that impression." Catherine leaned into his touch, allowing herself to be vulnerable in a way she hadn't been since her husband's death. "Is this too fast?" she whispered. "We've known each other such a short time." Clayton smiled, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. Some people search their whole lives and never find the kind of connection we discovered in days. I don't think time is the measure of what's growing between us." His words resonated deeply with Katherine. What she felt for Clayton wasn't the gradual affection that had grown into love with her husband. It was something immediate and powerful, born in crisis but flourishing in the quiet moments they had shared on their journey. "Then stay," she said, her decision made. "Stay and let us discover where this leads." Clayton's answer was to lean down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he kissed her a gentle, questioning kiss that asked rather than demanded. Katherine responded with a surety that surprised even her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. When they parted, Clayton kept his arms loosely around her, as if reluctant to break the connection. "I should go," he murmured. "I've taken a room at the hotel down the street." Katherine nodded, understanding the propriety of the situation, even as she wished he could stay closer. "Will you come tomorrow?" "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Clayton promised with a smile. "Besides, I still need to help Horace bring in the rest of our things from the wagon." Their parting was sweet, tinged with the anticipation of reunion rather than the sorrow of separation. As Katherine watched Clayton walk away, his tall figure disappearing into the Denver night, she felt a sense of rightness of coming home after a long journey. Upstairs, she checked on Thomas, sleeping peacefully in his cradle. "We're safe now," she whispered to her son. "And we're not alone anymore." The days that followed took on a rhythm that Katherine found both comforting and exciting. True to his word, Clayton called at the Jenkins home every day, sometimes staying for meals, other times taking Katherine and Thomas for short walks around the neighborhood as she gradually became familiar with her new surroundings. Mabel proved to be an exacting but fair mentor, quickly assessing Katherine's strengths as a teacher and giving her increasing responsibility in the classroom. The young ladies who attended the school were curious about the new teacher with the baby, but Mabel had evidently instructed them to respect Katherine's privacy, as no personal questions were forthcoming. Horace, for his part, doted on Thomas, often insisting on holding the baby while Katherine assisted in the bookshop during her free hours. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. Katherine earned extra money, and Horace got to indulge his love of children, having never had any of his own. Clayton, meanwhile, had indeed found work with the railroad, his surveying skills in high demand as Denver continued to expand. He rented rooms not far from the Jenkins home and joined them for dinner most evenings, gradually becoming as much a part of the household as Katherine and Thomas. It was during one such dinner, about a month after their arrival in Denver, that Horace raised a topic that had apparently been on his mind. "Clayton, my boy," he said as Mabel served dessert, "isn't it about time you made your intentions toward Katherine official? The neighbors are beginning to talk." Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks, and Clayton cleared his throat awkwardly. They had been courting in the traditional sense of the word, with Clayton always careful to maintain propriety despite the growing affection between them. "Horace." Mabel scolded. "That is hardly an appropriate dinner conversation," but Horace was undeterred. "I'm just saying what everyone is thinking. These two are clearly fond of each other. Thomas needs a father, and Clayton isn't getting any younger." "I'm 34, Horace, not ancient," Clayton protested, though there was humor in his voice. Katherine looked at Clayton across the table, finding his gaze already on her. There was a question in his eyes, one that had been forming for weeks now. "Perhaps Horace is right," she said softly. "Perhaps it is time we discussed our future." A smile spread slowly across Clayton's face. "I was planning to speak with you privately, but since Horace has so elegantly broached the subject." To Katherine's surprise and delight, Clayton rose from his seat and came around the table to kneel before her. From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box. "Katherine Granger," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "When I knocked on your cabin door that stormy night, I had no idea I was about to meet the woman who would change my life. In the short time we've known each other, you have shown me courage, strength, and a capacity for love that humbles me." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring. I promise to protect you and Thomas for the rest of my days, not because you need protection, but because it would be my honor to stand beside you as you face whatever life brings. Will you marry me? Katherine looked from the ring to Clayton's earnest face, tears of joy filling her eyes. She thought of their journey from her isolated cabin to this moment, the dangers they had faced together, the trust that had grown between them, the deep affection that had blossomed into love. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain. Yes, Clayton, I will marry you. As Clayton slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to embrace her, Katherine was vaguely aware of Horace wiping tears from his eyes and Mabel pretending to be busy with the dessert plates, while surreptitiously dabbing at her own eyes with a napkin. But mostly, she was aware of Clayton, the strength of his arms around her, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, the promise of a future together that she had never dared to hope for when she fled Redemption Creek with only her infant son and her courage. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, a simple ceremony in Denver's small Episcopal church. Mabel had insisted on providing Katherine with a proper wedding dress, and Horace gave her away with as much pride as if she had been his own daughter. Thomas, now nearly 6 months old and growing stronger every day, was held by Mabel during the ceremony, his curious eyes taking in the proceedings with apparent fascination. As Katherine and Clayton exchanged their vows, she marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a frightened widow hiding in a remote cabin to a respected teacher and soon-to-be wife, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Clayton's kiss was gentle yet full of promise, a promise of protection, of partnership, of love that would only grow stronger with time. The reception was held at the Jenkins home, a joyful gathering of Clayton's colleagues from the railroad, teachers and students from Mabel's school, and the handful of friends Katherine had made since coming to Denver. Thomas was passed from one admiring guest to another, charming everyone with his bright eyes and ready smile. "Are you happy, Mrs. Galloway?" Clayton murmured in Katherine's ear as they shared a moment alone on the porch where they had shared their first kiss. Katherine leaned into her husband's embrace, savoring the rightness of being in his arms. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly, "and grateful beyond words that you knocked on my door that night." Clayton smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I believe some things are meant to be, Katherine. I was meant to get lost that night to seek shelter at your cabin. We were meant to find each other." As the celebration continued around them, Katherine reflected on the truth of Clayton's words. Out of fear and danger had come love and security. Out of loneliness had come family. Out of hiding had come the freedom to live openly and without fear. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter filled the garden behind the modest but comfortable house on the outskirts of Denver. Katherine sat on the porch, watching as Clayton chased 5-year-old Thomas and 3-year-old Sarah around the yard, all three of them breathless with laughter. "Papa, catch me," Sarah squealed, her dark curls bouncing as she ran from her father. Clayton made a show of trying but failing to catch his daughter, while Thomas came to his sister's defense, tackling his father around the knees. Clayton went down in an exaggerated fall, and soon both children were climbing on him, giggling triumphantly. Katherine smiled, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their third child grew. The years since their marriage had been full of joy, growth, and the occasional challenge, but never once had she regretted her decision to trust the stranger who had promised her protection. Clayton had proven to be not just a protector, but a devoted husband and father. He had legally adopted Thomas within weeks of their marriage, giving the boy his name and his unconditional love. When Sarah was born 2 years later, Clayton had wept with joy, holding his daughter with a tenderness that still moved Katherine whenever she remembered it. Their life in Denver had flourished. Katherine continued to teach at Mabel's school, eventually becoming co-headmistress when Mabel semi-retired. Clayton had advanced in his work with the railroad, now overseeing all surveying operations in the Colorado Territory. They had built this house together, creating a home filled with books, music, and laughter, everything Katherine had dreamed of for her children. The specter of Redemption Creek had faded over the years, though Katherine never forgot the lessons she had learned there about fear, ignorance, and the darkness that could live in people's hearts. She taught her children tolerance and understanding, hoping they would grow up to challenge superstition and cruelty wherever they encountered it. "What are you thinking about, love?" Clayton asked, dropping onto the porch step beside her, breathless from play. Thomas and Sarah had moved on to a game of their own invention, involving elaborate rules that only they understood. Katherine leaned against his shoulder, taking comfort in his solid presence beside her. "I was thinking about how far we've come," she replied. "About that night in the cabin when you knocked on my door," Clayton smiled, his arms slipping around her shoulders. "Best wrong turn I ever took," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I maintain it wasn't chance at all, but providence." "Perhaps," Katherine agreed. She had made her peace with the idea that some greater force might have guided Clayton to her door that night. Whether it was God, fate, or simply the interconnectedness of all human lives, she was grateful for whatever had brought them together. As the sun began to set over the mountains to the west, casting long, golden rays across their garden, Clayton helped Katherine to her feet. "Come on, you two," he called to the children. "Time to wash up for dinner." Thomas and Sarah raced toward the house, full of stories they wanted to tell about their adventures in the garden. Clayton and Katherine followed more slowly, his arm supporting her as she navigated the steps. Inside their home, lamps were being lit against the gathering dusk. The table was set for dinner, books were stacked on side tables ready to be read aloud before bedtime, and a fire crackled in the hearth despite the summer evening, keeping the mountain chill at bay. It was everything Katherine had once feared was lost to her forever: security, family, belonging. And it had all begun with a storm, a cabin in the woods, and a stranger's knock at her door. "I love you, Clayton Galloway," she said softly as they entered their home. "Thank you for finding me, for saving us." Clayton's eyes, still as blue and clear as they had been that first night, met hers with understanding. "And I love you, Katherine Galloway. Thank you for being brave enough to open your door, to let me in." As their children's voices filled the house with chatter and their unborn child moved within her, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety, but her true home in the arms of the man who had promised protection and delivered so much more.